Well, welcome everybody. I'm Sari Karp. I'm the Executive Director of Sustainability Matters, and we are the environmental conservation nonprofit that is hosting this webinar. Many of you have joined us before for webinars on a wide variety of conservation and environmental topics, including our Greener Than Grass program, sustainable landscaping, how to grow your own food, how to preserve your own food once you have grown it, recent topics in recycling, woodland gardens, you name it, even how to get conservation practices funded on your end, where our focus really is education and outreach that is practical, giving you concrete tools on how you can make your situation better on your land, for your family, and also make the environment better in the process. We never tell anybody to do things that we haven't been doing ourselves and that we don't think are realistic for most people. And weeds and weed control, weed management is really no exception. It's a topic that can be very overwhelming, very frustrating. And some of the information that's out there really works only if you have a very tiny property, like maybe a containers on your balcony, or a really small urban yard, and a fair amount of energy, or if you have unlimited resources. And we know that most people who are dealing with weeds do not fall into those categories. This webinar is going to be a little bit different from our norm. We often do presentations, and this is really going to be much more of a conversation. And this might even be the most controversial event we have ever done. Nan, whom some of you have met before on our Zoom team for other webinars, when she signed up for the Zoom team for this one, she said to me, "I'm really glad that our team is brave enough to be doing this." So why do you have to be brave to take on weeds? Weeds are controversial, or at least management of weeds is controversial. And even really what is a weed is controversial. Your weed might be my pollinator plant. Like behind me are some native weeds, jewelweed and wingstem. One of them is one of my favorite natives ever. The other one is probably one of my least favorite natives ever because it is so aggressive, but Jack here absolutely loves it. So, we're going to talk about how you define weeds, how you prioritize and what to do. And we are going to tackle the elephant in the room, the most controversial aspect of weed control, herbicides. And that is something that there's really, we're doing this webinar in part because there's so little information out there that is not one extreme or the other, that is not all herbicides are equally evil and you are poisoning the world if you use them, or sure, it's okay, just go get that can of Roundup from the big box store and spray it wherever. And I think what we're going to show you is that there is a continuum of responses. There are a number of right answers on how to deal with weeds, but and really what the right answer is depends on you and your circumstances and your priorities. There are also a few wrong answers, and we're going to talk about those too. So I think Sonia is going to put up a poll for you to tell us a little bit about you and your background and your weed interests. And I'm also going to introduce you to our panelists. We're going to be having a conversation that we encourage you to join by asking questions. And Sonia will kind of go into the tech housekeeping for that. Do you want to do that, Sonia, while they're filling out the poll, and then we'll introduce everybody?
And I apologize, it looked like the chat was disabled for a while there, but I think it's back on. So feel free to chat in the chat. We do ask that if you've got questions that you put them in the Q&A, just because it's easier for us to find them. And if you see one that's in there that you're curious about as well, you can upvote them. And so the very popular ones will rise to the top, and we will cover those as we go through. And then if you do want to, if you have like a more complicated question and you want to ask it out loud, feel free to raise your hand and we can then unmute you at the time and have you speak up. And also for the folks on Facebook, welcome. Pop your questions in the chat there and we'll port them over here for the panelists. We are recording this, and the recording will be available within the next day or so, and it's going to remain up for about a week. We have storage issues, so it's not going to be there forever. So if you want to re-listen, go for it. And then eventually we'll have a more sort of polished final version that will be available on YouTube that everyone can watch and share. And then there will also be a recording on our Facebook page in the video section. So we'll get to as many questions as we can. We know that we have folks dialing in from all around the world, so not everything is going to be completely relevant to your where you're coming from, but a lot of these will be sort of applicable to all. So we will answer as many questions as we possibly can, and we are glad you're here.
Absolutely. And I think that that's something that we try with a lot of our webinars. You've seen before, is to really provide you with techniques and ideas and plans that are universal wherever you live. We've got a dedicated Australian audience. I think some of them are probably here tonight, and they certainly don't have all the same plans we do, or even most of them. But I think that they've found that the information that we provide is applicable in their circumstances, and so there should be something for everybody here, I feel like, right? So, do you want to show the poll results so we know where people are? They say the poll looks like it's disappeared.
Yeah, we're having some technical issues with the poll as well, but we've got folks that have been putting their location in chat, so we can kind of scroll through that and see lots of Virginia folks, Pennsylvania, Maryland. We have someone from Phoenix, Arizona. That's awesome. Montreal, Canada. So we've got folks who are local as well as dialing in from all over the world, and we definitely appreciate that. So yeah, again, apologies that the poll seems to be stuck, but if you want to put your location in the chat, we would love to hear where you are from, and also kind of what your what size plot you have, and what kind of weeds you've got, and if you have invasives, you've got aggressive natives, weedy trees, vines, ground covers, that kind of thing. We'd love to hear what your troubles are, so that we can make sure that we address those as we go through and talk about the specifics. And also the other question in the poll was how do you currently manage your weeds? Do you weed them by hand? Do you till or dig, burning, herbicide, suppression like via mulch, or just leave them alone and let them do their thing?
Yep. And we have on our panel, the brave panelists are a wide range of weed experts, and I guess when I say experts, I should add that we none of us is an herbicide expert or professional in that field. Jack Monstead here is a conservation professional who manages a huge property with a lot of weeds for thing. He's our native plants curator, native meadows curator, really, at the State Arboretum of Virginia. So how many acres, Jack, full of some weeds and a lot of good things?
It's about 34 acres, the area that I specifically manage. So yeah, it's a good size meadow. And yeah, lots of different interesting weeds out there.
Yep. And he's got, a lot of experience of kind of what to prioritize and how to deal with things. I am on 21 acres of mixed natives and invasives. I've been trying to plant more natives and deal with the invasives and hit a lot of road bumps along the way. So hopefully learning from a lot of them. Deb and Nan and Sonia are in somewhat smaller properties, but I think Sonia, you're really in the urban area. So
yeah, I have a teeny postage stamp lawn in Falls Church inside the Beltway, so I have a very small amount. Still, the weeds are still pretty nasty, but there's a lot fewer of them.
Right. And Deb is really an epic vegetable gardener. Deb is my vegetable gardening hero, and grows just enough to, I think, feed most of the county. And she does it without herbicides, and she does it with, various natural weed suppression techniques that she's going to talk about. But she
blood, sweat, and tears.
Yes, blood, sweat, and tears. That really is something we should put in the poll, right, as an option for what is your main tool against those weeds, is blood, sweat, and tears. But Deb's facing a lot of invasives as well for property, and Nan too, right? You've got kind of a mixed zone You're muted.
Yes. Yes. Trees and meadow and all sorts of various things. Yeah.
Yeah. So, cool. All right. Well, the poll, I think the poll's done. Okay. Zoom. Oh, and we have the results. Fantastic. All
Got it
right.
working. Took a minute. We're having some fun
Yeah.
with technical issues, but we'll get there eventually.
Yeah.
So
Well, Sonia's our communications director and has put out many a Zoom fire before, some far more dramatic than this, like when one of our presenters' rural internet just completely disappeared in the middle of the webinar. So,
Struggle
you
is
know,
real.
been there, done that, right?
Roll with it. It's all good.
Absolutely. All right. Anything else we kind of want to, right before we just sort of jump into talking weeds? All right. So I think what we wanted to really start with was the question of what is a weed? I'm sure you have all heard some version of the old adage of a weed is just a plant in the wrong place. But what does that really mean? Jack, you want to kick us off with that?
Sure. So just to give you guys a little bit of background here, I work, the section that I manage at the Arboretum is called the Native Plant Trail. So our focus is on preserving native plants specifically. And I think that's a really big component, at least for me, in terms of what constitutes a weed. So for those of you who don't know, we'll probably use the word natives versus invasives a lot. I don't know if I really need to explain that at the moment, but basically a native plant.
Go ahead and explain it. Yeah.
Yeah, sure.
Go for it.
So a native plant is basically a plant that has evolved in the landscape in which you live, in which you're managing. So these are plants that have been there for thousands and thousands of years. They kind of have co-evolved relationships with all the other plants and animals and stuff in the region. Whereas a non-native plant is a plant that has been transported to this whatever region you're in by humans. So usually these are plants that have been introduced only within the last few hundred years. And so they have not had the time to really establish any sort of co-evolved relationships or really fit into the ecosystem at all. And so sometimes what that leads to is those non-native plants, because no native insects or anything will eat them because they don't know about these plants. Those non-native plants can really become really, really aggressive, and they can start to take over and crowd out native plants that are, dealing with all these other pressures that are in the landscape. So those plants are what we call invasives. And invasive plants they are non-native by definition. And for me, that's the biggest weeds, the most things I'm focusing on when I talk about weeds is invasive plants, because they are non-native plants. They're not contributing to the ecosystem very much. They're not really providing much habitat for any of our native fauna, any of our native insects or anything like that. And so I consider, and they're also actively taking space away from our native plants that would otherwise be providing really good habitat and really good, ecosystem services. So whenever I see invasive plants, that's always at the top of my list for things that I need to try to control or, replace with natives. But, other people, as Sari said earlier, and some people say that a weed is just a plant that's in the wrong place. And, there are native plants that can be really aggressive, and that, if given a certain type of, whatever kind of land use we are doing to our land, they can become really aggressive, and you might have to control native plants sometimes too. I do have a lot of natives as well that I sometimes work just to push back or keep under control, just so other things can grow and it's not a monoculture. So that's kind of my perspective on what weeds are.
Hey, Jack, I just wanted to mention, since you're kind of hitting this topic, one of our people in chat put down she's having problems with maypop or passion vine, and a lot of people at Sustainability Matters knows that my passion vine is insane, so I can commiserate with her on that.
That's definitely one of the aggressive natives. I think that's also just the nature of vines a lot of the time. If you get vines like to spread, that's what they do by nature. And so if you got vines, you're going to want to keep them under control if you don't want them spreading all over your property.
And different people have different definitions and different, so, I was very excited about Deb's passion vine, and I planted it, and it has now pretty much completely taken over my shed, and all of the ground around it, which I actually don't particularly mind because I don't want a lawn. I'm getting rid of grass. I don't want to mow. And so I'm basically experimenting with Deb's maypop, the passion flower vine, as a ground cover to see how that works. But it did give me pause seeing what it did. And when another of our people, Hannah Beeman, our scientific programs coordinator, gave me another aggressive native honeyvine milkweed, I then really thought about where I was going to put that, somewhere where I wanted it to take over. And the took that into account. So the thing, something that we talk about a lot is, okay, people say, well, these invasives, how did they get here? And humans not only brought them, many of them deliberately, because they tasted good or they thought they had medicinal properties, or accidentally, some of the Asian invasives came over in packing materials for, Japanese ceramics or whatever else. But they also really do follow humans around. I think, Nan, that's something that you've thought a lot about, right?
Yeah. Weeds are, they follow humans around. They are adapted to the disturbed environments that humans make. And pretty much everything we do kind of disturbs the environment. So what I've read is that they were around actually before agriculture. And so maybe they would move into an area like where a tree fell or where there had been a fire. But with mankind, humans coming along, we really created the environment for weeds. And especially with agriculture, we really create the environment for weeds. So even though we complain about them, we actually provide these open spaces, and they're an ecological class of plants that are able to take over an area, a bare area, really quickly.
Yeah. So, and that's something that, we go into in great detail. If you watch our Greener Than Grass webinar, which is up on our YouTube, one of the things that we really talk about is just, getting rid of the invasives is not enough. You have to have a plan for what you're going to do and what you're going to put in that space. And your plan has to be to replace them immediately, because nature abhors a vacuum. And so you should not, if you're creating disturbance, you better fix it fast, because otherwise, nature will fix it, and it will probably not be in a way that you like. So I think that, plan. I mean, you can avoid weeds by really figuring out what you're going to plant, and figuring out if you want something aggressive in that area and how aggressive. And like Jack said, vines are aggressive. That's what they do. If you don't want something aggressive in an area, don't plant a vine. And
So I really like that point that you brought up of nature abhors a vacuum. That's something that I think about all the time when I'm managing the property at the Arboretum, because if you just go out and, say you use whatever weeding method we get to talk about eventually, maybe you till it, maybe you herbicide, whatever you're doing, if you kill off all those weeds, what's going to come back? If you have bare ground, if you have disturbed empty areas, something will be growing there at some point. So really the best defense against weeds, in my opinion, and from what I've seen a lot, is to really just be planting the things that you want to grow there, and that are going to do as well or better than the weeds that you don't want. So effectively siting the plants, making sure that you're planting things. If you have a wide open sunny meadow, you don't want to be planting, trilliums and Virginia bluebells, because they're not going to do well there. You want to be planting things that are adapted to those areas. And so, yeah, I mean, sometimes, you might get lucky if you kill all the invasives off. Maybe you'll have a nice native seed bank and all your good beneficial native plants will pop up, and that's what you want. But, more often than not, especially if areas have been under human management for a very long time, something's been a farm field for 20 years or something like that, you're probably not going to have that. So you want to make sure that you plant things, and the less disturbance you can do to bring up those invasive weed seeds, the better off you're going to be.
absolutely. I think if you take one thing away from today, it is knowledge is your friend. We're basically telling you there's no magic bullet, there's no magic wand that you can wave to get rid of your weeds. There's no perfect solution, but knowledge is your best armament. And it's like dealing with humans. Know your friends really well and your enemies better. And if there's a plant that you want, like Jack said, make sure you're planting it in the right place. I have so many times put something where I thought it would look good, and it was, too dry or too wet or, too much competition. And I've ended up either killing it or having to move it. And so you have to go with what's right for the plant. And you also have to understand, and we're going to go into this in more detail, you have to understand the plants you want to get rid of, because just going out and trying to kill them at any time of the year is not going to work. You have to target them when they're weak, the same way that you would a human enemy. You really have to go after something when what weapons you have are going to be the most effective, and that's the only way that you are not going to be driven completely crazy by weed control, right, Jack?
Yep. You gotta take the plant's perspective. You have to look at things from how the plants look at them.
That's great. Think like a plant.
Yep.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And so what I think one thing we haven't really talked about is amongst the different types of weeds, what if you are completely overwhelmed by different types of weeds, weedy trees, weedy vines, weedy ground covers, and also perennial versus annual weeds, and you can't do it all? How do you choose your priorities?
I think for me personally, I think woody trees is potentially a really big issue, especially if they're small. You have to think about it in the long term. Like if you only have so much time and you have an autumn olive tree, or whatever invasive tree, or a Bradford pear that's starting to pop up in your back 40. If you get a wild small, it's a lot easier than having to cut down a very, very large tree and deal with it that way. So things like that can be really important. I've also heard that a good adage is actually to focus on some of the areas that are the least bad. So if you have a big area and one area is absolutely covered in invasives and weeds and just a complete mess, whereas another area is kind of good, there's some stuff growing there that you want, but there's a few invasives creeping in, deal with that area first. The really bad area will always be bad, and it'll be there for when you need to get to it. But if you can stop a weed problem from getting bad in the first place, you're going to be better off.
Absolutely. And the sooner you get it, as long as it's the right time in its growing cycle, the better off you'll be. If you let your invasive go this year, next year you'll have 20 times as much. And if you're spraying, you'll have to use 20 times as much chemicals to get rid of it, or 20 times as much labor if you're digging. And so yeah, that's definitely something. I think also too, as you learn more about them and as you learn to identify your invasives, you'll know what's really common in your area and what is new. And so like on my property, I now have something called wavy leaf grass, which is very common in other parts of the mid-Atlantic and of Virginia, but is theoretically, I'm the first person on my side of a mountain range to have it. I'm sure I'm not. I'm just the first person who actually reported it to the state offices, but I still don't have much of it. And so that's something that I'm thinking, all right, let's prioritize getting rid of that because I still have relatively small amounts of it. And there are other things that I'm never going to get rid of, all the Japanese stiltgrass. So, that would be a futile exercise. Yeah, so I think that's what, I guess, any opinions on perennial versus annual weeds? Well, I mean, and the difference for anybody who's wondering is just that an annual is a plant that dies in 1 year, and so it's not going to come back next year. It may very prolifically self-seed like Japanese fieldgrass. So just thinking, oh well, it won't be back next year doesn't mean you necessarily want to let it go to seed. But it's not like, say, honeysuckle, invasive honeysuckle, that is going to come back even bigger or never really die down.
So, Sari, I've got a little experience that I recently had on our property. We had an invasion of spiny amaranth And I think that the spiny amaranth may have come in bird seed, because I don't have it anywhere else except near my poultry pen. So anyway, we went through a lot of trouble to literally hand dig, hand weed, pull it all out, and I have no incidences of that back now, but I got it before it went to seed. And I think that's really important when you're talking about trying to get rid of something that's a one-off, is to get it before it goes to seed. Now, on the other side of that, since all of that ground was disturbed, I now have a plethora of a white vervain. But the bees seem to love it, and my chickens are hiding in it, and I'm letting that go.
And
And-
to my point earlier, white vervain is a native plant for where you are. So
Yeah, so
that's a trade-off in my view.
exactly. Exactly. And that's why it's still there. I mean, literally the bees just love it. And and like I said, it's tall enough, it's probably 3-4 feet tall. My chickens hide in it from the hawks, so I'm okay with that.
Nice.
But it's much better than the spiny amaranth. Let me tell you, that stuff is awful.
One thing that always comes to mind for me in terms of annual versus perennial weeds is that the annual weeds, as Deb said, yes, get them before they seed, because they're always regenerating from seed. They're not coming back from any rootstock or anything. So if you can just mow them down before they seed, keep mowing them every time they try to flower throughout the year so they can't set seed. If you don't have a lot of seeds already in the seed bank, that might be all you need to get rid of them. If you do, then the seeds that are already in the seed bank will keep coming back, and you have to keep doing that year after year to really start to thin them out. The other thing that you can think about is planting things that are longer lived, maybe native plants, or whatever you kind of plant you want to grow. Planting longer lived native perennials, maybe you get some adult plants, you plant them in amongst the weeds. Gradually, those perennials are going to keep coming back year after year, and they're going to spread. So they're going to have a competitive advantage over the long term. So eventually your native long-lived perennials are just going to grow over and smother whatever annual weeds you have, if you can get them established, So, and that's not true for all cases. I had this stilt grass. You can see behind me, this is a field of Japanese stilt grass. That is an annual weed that is not wildly invasive here in the mid-Atlantic. And sometimes it's really hard to get things established in a field of stilt grass like that. But for certain weeds, it can definitely work.
And I think that's the key too, is don't bite off more than you can chew while you're getting things established. And this is something like, what Jack's talking about, whether you're planting a bed, just a small bed of native plants near your house, or 30 acres of meadows or 300 acres of meadows, the worst maintenance is going to be in the beginning when you're getting them established, because that's when things are filling in, and that's when you're getting stuff. So we have a project that our organization does in partnership with Blandy, with Arboretum, called Making Trash Bloom. And it is planting pollinator meadows at landfills, putting them on top of trash cells where normally turf grass, which has no environmental benefits, is grown, and really using that space and using it as a public demonstration space. And one of the things that is challenging for us is explaining to the landfills who have not traditionally done this kind of landscaping that, listen, in the long run, this is going to save you time, because you're not going to have to mow it multiple times a year the way that you do the turf grass. But in the beginning, it is higher maintenance. And, so what we saw in the first pilot plot that we planted, the first year, it was really daunting because it was much closer than we had known to the landfill's brush pile, where everybody dropped their invasive thistles and all their other seeds, and it seeded into the pilot plot. And we thought, oh, this is going to be such a disaster. But the thistles are biennial. And, we did weed some of them out. So that means that they're twice the time of an annual. They live for 2 years. And now, the native perennials that we planted, the really aggressive native perennials, are out competing. So there's a lot of native bee balm in there this year. And I was still so worried that when the landfill operations manager called me, he's like, oh, that thing with the purple flowers, it's doing great. It's covered in bees. And I thought, oh my God, the thistles are back. And I didn't even think about it. But fortunately, I did not tell him to kill it because I got there and it was the native bee balm and it was just everywhere and really quite successfully outcompeted. So yeah, if you do it right and you're patient, I think you can get there, and that's a good management technique. I think something we've sort of mentioned too is the issue of timing, of getting something at the right point in its life cycle. I think we should probably go into that in a little bit more detail and just kind of talk without, too deep a dive into botany. Anybody want to take that?
Well, I could say for me, for a lot of that depends on what method you're using. Timing, if we're talking about annuals and you want to mow them before they set seed, that's important. You mow it just as they're starting to flower or before they flower, because once they start flowering, really, they're going to, a lot of them, especially if they're annuals, will set seed very quickly. But if you're talking about other things, so if, for example, if you wanted to do a cut and treat on a tree, so say you had an invasive tree or something, and you wanted to get rid of it, and you were going to cut it down, there's a treatment you can do called cut and treat, which is where you cut the tree down, and then you put a tiny bit of herbicide just around the top of the stump, and that'll go down and kill the root so it doesn't resprout. For example, that is actually more effective to do in the fall, almost always, because that's when the tree is pulling nutrients down into the roots. And so if you put the herbicide on it, it'll pull the herbicide down into the roots. So you really have to think about what method you're using and how you can use timing to exploit the plant's weaknesses.
Right. And research the plant too, so that like silk grass is a warm season grass. So it's most actively growing in the summer and you've got a time around that. Whereas something like chickweed or garlic mustard are cool season weeds that come, in the spring and the fall, and they might germinate and be really tiny in the fall, and then they'll really explode in the spring, and that's when you'll notice them. And so you plan around that and research your research your different plants, and you can find a lot of information about that online in our area, which is the sort of, well, really most of Virginia at this point. There's an organization called Blue Ridge Prism that has great fact sheets on a lot of the invasive plants and tells you sort of specific things about one particular plant and how to go after that. In general, it really does go back to know your enemy and know its habits, know its life cycle. So I guess, do we want to do a couple of questions and then move on to the weed control options and different techniques? Any questions that are particularly popular?
We have a question from Amanda who has to bounce a little early, so we'll try to get hers in there. And she's interested in knowing if anything can shade out goutweed or annoy it via allelopathy. I'm not sure how to pronounce that. Also drowning in porcelainberry. Currently have done suppression and digging, and I'm going to be daubing herbicide on cut stems, which I guess is kind of what Jack was talking about. So why is this controversial? She notes that it's banned in Canada, for example. And just, I think, wants some help with this goutweed issue.
I'm not so familiar with goutweed. Do you know a lot about goutweed, Sari?
I do not at all.
Dumped us.
Yeah, that's not an invasive that I encounter very often.
I do know porcelainberry, and we don't have it out here in Western Virginia yet, knock on wood, but certainly in Northern Virginia, that's an issue. We're about to do a making trash bloom project at the Fairfax County landfill, and yeah, porcelainberry is a thing out there, and it's yet another extremely aggressive vine. I think cut stumping with the painting the herbicide on the stump, a concentrated herbicide. It does seem to be a really effective method for a lot of those. Again, if you do it at the right time of year. In terms of the controversy, I'm assuming that what she's talking about is that the herbicide is controversial, not the weeds, right?
Weed.
Sonia?
Could be. You can't sell the weed.
Or the method of application, daubing. I'm not sure what part is controversial in Canada, but we don't work in Canada, so we don't know the rules and regulations up there. But daubing isn't any different than like what you're talking about, just painting the top of the tree stump or something like that. You're just putting a little bit on. So I don't know if the method is really the issue. Also, and apparently goutweed is considered the cockroach of the botanical world. It runs in underground rhizomes, and having some plants that run by underground rhizomes, that's a huge pain to deal with. I don't have any magic bullet for that.
Yeah. You know, what's all, I can't really speak to goutweed so much, but yeah, I mean, it's porcelain berries are the same thing, I presume. I mean, a lot of these vines just do that. They're really hard. Like vines are actually some of the hardest things to get rid of. And a big reason for that is a lot of times they grow in and around things that you want. So, you know, be climbing up trees that you want to keep, or just weaving their way through an otherwise pretty nice field that you want to keep, or whatever. And so that can make it really difficult because, you know, you can't just, you know, herbicide a whole area or, you know, burn a whole area or something like that. So, honestly, some of the vines, and also digging them up is almost impossible because a lot of them have these underground roots that just go everywhere and you just physically cannot dig them all up. Like it would be impossible.
Or if you leave a half of an inch of a piece in there, that's going to regrow. That's the part that kills me on some of those things. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. For me, one of the vines we have really bad in the Arboretum is this one called Everlasting Sweet Pea. It's a Lathyrus latifolius. It's a pea vine that was planted horticulturally by a lot of people. Some people still plant it in their gardens here. And it runs like crazy and it has these really thick roots that go everywhere. And I have found that herbicide works well if it's in a patch by itself, but it's climbing up things. The best thing I do is I just pull it up. I just go out there and you know, I have a section where it just climbs up a bunch of really nice dogwood trees that we have. And I just go out there twice a year and I just pull all the vines down, pull them as close to the ground as I can. And then, you know, once or twice a year, it takes me a couple hours each time. And then the next year I go back and there's less of it. So if you keep up with doing it, you can handle things, you know, just doing it by hand if you have a small enough area. And over time, those roots will exhaust themselves, keep trying to climb back, but you have to keep up with it.
Yeah, Jack, that's the process that I'm using. The hill outside my garage was covered with English ivy, lovely English ivy, and climbing up several of my pine trees. And so, you know, you did the 3 feet of separation so that the vines at the top of the pine trees die off. And then we weed whacked all of what we could see. And then just, I keep pulling it up as I see it. Once a weed whacked that first layer of all the leaves, which is just like a mass, it was really hard to find out where the pieces went. But then once we got the leaves gone, then I could start pulling up all of the various pieces. And I'm still doing that a year and a half later. I see a little piece come up, I dig it up. I see a little piece come up over there, I dig it up. And it's an ongoing effort. Somebody has also mentioned in the chat that they live near a property that has a lot of invasives and they're doing the best on their property, but it's a 25-year battle. And it is. You just keep battling the invasives. That's all, you know, you really can do.
And that's where the personal choices come in. Like how much, you know, how much space you have, how much, you know, if you're living on 1/10 of an acre and you have the time and power, you can manage this with hand weeding. You can actually have the holy grail of no invasives and no herbicides. But if you're on a bigger property, often you have to make choices. So I think we should move on, because I noticed in the chat there have been a number of questions about herbicides, and you know, where we are confidently expecting some controversial comments and people who are not necessarily happy with what we're saying from both sides of the spectrum, because a lot of conservationists feel that anything is warranted to get rid of invasive species, and others feel that no herbicide use is warranted under any circumstances. They're both right. There's a continuum along there, and you have to decide kind of where you're comfortable with that. But again, knowledge is your friend, information is your friend. And I think 2 points that we want to make, first of all, about herbicides is that not all herbicides are the same, and not all are equally toxic environmentally, to humans, to plants. But also, everything's a trade-off. There is no absolutely perfect method of weed control. People say, well, if you're tilling, that's much safer than, or much better than herbicides. Tilling disturbs the soil. It can bring invasive seeds up to the surface, and you'll get more invasives, and then you'll have to deal with them. It can also, it does disturb the soil structure and destroy the soil structure. And more research is showing that soil structure is extremely important for plants. There are all kinds of beneficial microscopic organisms under there that get damaged, disrupted by tilling. So, but on the other hand, I think some of us in the conservation movement have been guilty of saying, whatever you spray, it's okay, except the collateral damage, plant good stuff, will come back. We're not really in that camp either. And so I think we're going to talk about 3 specific herbicides that we feel are safe when used properly and in the right formulations. Safe does not mean perfectly safe. These are herbicides. These are killers. These are toxins. That is something to keep in mind, and you need to treat that with huge respect. The same way that you would something like if you had a wasp's nest in your house and you felt you had no alternative but to spray it, the same way that you would treat that wasp spray. Another point I think that we were talking about kind of before this webinar is, with chemicals, we don't know what we don't know. When DDT first came out, everybody thought it was safe. We do believe certainly that vetting procedures are much more rigorous now, much more careful, that there's research out there, but some of it's still driven by funding and issues, and just, again, we're humans, we are fallible, we make mistakes, we have limited understanding. And so because of that, I think anything that has toxicity, you want to be really careful about. The other main thing about herbicides is, the go-to Roundup. That's the one that everybody thinks that if they know one herbicide, they know Roundup. And a lot of you may have heard recently that glyphosate, which is the active ingredient in Roundup, the thing that kills plants, has been found to be toxic to humans. There's been a lot of controversy about this. And people assume that the glyphosate is probably the worst, most toxic thing for the environment as well. I recently heard it referred to as Agent Orange. There are herbicides that are far more toxic environmentally than glyphosate that really could legitimately be described as Agent Orange. From an environmental point of view, actually the most toxic ingredient in Roundup is the surfactant. It's what's called the stick, out here, so as people call it, the sticker. It's the additive that makes it stick to the plant, which is necessary to have a surfactant if you're broadcast spraying. But this is actually the thing that causes the most damage to the watershed, that is very toxic to fish, to amphibians. Even if you think you don't live near water, we know that everything gets into the watershed eventually. And if you have any toads, believe me, you want them around. Toads don't necessarily always live near water. They are the best natural pest control. One American toad will kill, 10,000 garden pests, bugs in a 3-month summer. You do not want to hurt your toads. And the surfactant in Roundup and in, as far as I know, all of the pre-mixed big box store herbicides will do that. The good news is that you can get glyphosate in an aquatic safe formula, and you can mix it with an aquatic safe surfactant. And so you can avoid some of this environmental toxicity. So this is what I was talking about with, okay, there are some wrong answers. Going and buying Roundup, just a wrong answer. Using glyphosate, not necessarily a wrong answer. Jack, do you want to go into a bit more detail about the three types of herbicides, the glyphosate and then the broadleaf specific and grass specifics?
Sure. So I'm going to talk about just three. I don't use a lot of herbicides in my day-to-day work, but there's a couple that I do use just because they are the most effective solution and can do actually, you cause the least amount of damage compared to the other options I have for weed control. I'm not like, I'm not going to just preface this by saying I actually started off in the organic farming industry. So I'm not like huge into herbicides, but I recognize that there are some important uses for them. So I'll give you a rundown. I've done a fair amount of research on many of these before I use them. I'm certified pesticide applicator, so I know the basic things about a lot of these. So glyphosate is one that we're talking about here, and that's probably the one that I actually use most. So as Sari said, you don't want to use Roundup right away. You want to use a glyphosate formulation that doesn't have a surfactant, and then you want to add in your aquatic safe surfactant. It's just, really good for all those toads and all those other amphibians that Sari said. The nice thing about glyphosate is that it is a broad spectrum herbicide. So that means that it basically kills all plants. So it targets a specific part of the plant that is universal across every single plant. So any plant that it comes in contact with, it will kill. A couple of caveats to that. First of all, it has to come in contact with the plant while the plant is actively growing. You can't spray it in the winter when all the plants are dead and brown, expect it to do anything. That's just, it's not good use of it. So you got to spray it while the plant is actually growing and has to come in direct contact with the parts of the plants that are growing. What else do I want to say about glyphosate? Another relatively nice thing about glyphosate is that its half-life in the soil after you spray it is relatively short. So as again, we go back to timing and how nature abhors a vacuum and how you always want to plant something after you do any sort of weed control. I always, whenever I'm doing a broad spectrum spray of glyphosate, I always want to plant something right after that. So that way I know that I'm not going to have to do it again. I can just do it once and be done with it. And with glyphosate, you can spray and you can plant again within a few days. So it doesn't hang around in the soil. It's not going to kill the things that you plant several days later. So just something to keep in mind. It's useful in that sense. And also, because of that, it breaks down very quickly in the environment. So it's not going to stick around and cause potential long-term damage to insects or anything else that might come into contact with it. I will also point out, though, with glyphosate, you do want to use it as minimally as possible. There have been studies recently, actually, that has showed that it is not good for native or for pollinators, for bees and stuff. So plants that have been treated with glyphosate very recently, if a bee visits a flower that has recently been sprayed with glyphosate and gets the glyphosate on it, doesn't always kill the bees, but it can cause problems with a lot of their, it can cause health problems for them, and that can lead to some sort of environmental damage. So again, too, with timing, if you are going to be spraying glyphosate on anything, make sure you're spraying it when the plants are not flowering, if possible, to avoid that kind of thing, because then the insects will not be there to get it on them.
Just before you move on to the next herbicide, just a general point about all herbicides that Jack's just alluded to is you always want to use the minimum that will have impact. You never, under any circumstances, want to use more than it says to use on the label. The label, there is actually this thing, the label is the law, and you are violating the law if you spray in a way that the label does not recommend. But again, you should not deviate from that. Treat that with as much respect as you would treat a pesticide or any other toxin. And the stuff that Jack's telling you that it's not going to last too long in the soil, etc., that is the case when you spray as directed. It is not the case if you overspray. More is not better. More will not kill the plant faster or kill more plants. So that's something to bear in mind whenever you're using any chemical.
Yep. Okay, so do you want to move on to the next one?
Yeah, I would say, yeah, just a little bit about, triclopier and clethodim, the specifics.
Yep.
So, yeah.
So next I just want to mention clethodim. I believe it's a brand name. I don't think that's a chemical name. Or maybe it is, I'm not sure.
What, the clethodim?
Clethodim, yeah.
Yeah, no, clethidim's the chemical. Yeah.
Yeah. So that is one that is, I say, somewhat selective for grasses specifically. So if you have a lot of invasive grasses that you need to deal with, clethodim is potentially an option, especially if those grasses are mixed in with things that you don't want to damage that are not grasses. So things that are, when I say not grasses, forbs, trees, something like that. Clethodim can be an option. It seems to be, it targets grasses more than it targets other things. Now, that's not to say it's perfectly safe for other plants. I've seen it sprayed and it'll go through and it'll kill all the grass that's there. But some of the other things that get hit by it kind of turn yellow. Maybe they don't die, but it does kind of damage them a little bit. So you want to be careful. It's not just like an easy cure-all, just to kill all your grasses, spray clethodim. It also breaks down relatively quickly in the soil. I don't think quite as fast as glyphosate, but has a relatively short half-life, can be used for grasses. And then the last one that I will mention that I have used is triclopier. So triclopier comes in a lot of different brand names. The one that I'm most familiar with is using Garlon 3A. I don't want to plug any, I guess I just plugged a brand, but I'm just saying, because that's just what I have used. That's what we usually use with the Arboretum. This is a kind of the opposite of clethodim. This is one that will not harm grasses for the most part. It does target all woody plants and broadleaf plants. So any forbs, any trees, any herbaceous stuff that is not a grass, it could potentially be used for. This really, the only time that I use triclopier in my daily work is if I'm doing that cut stump treatment that I said. So if I cut down a tree that I don't want, you put a little bit of the triclopier right around the edge of the tree, and you put it. The trick is you got to get it right around the edge, like the outside edge, all the way around the outside of the edge, just with a little bingo dotter almost. You fill it with the herbicide. You can get those called dabbing. And so I use it on those. It's pretty effective. The only problem with the triclopier, and something you really have to consider, is that it does stick around in the soil for a lot longer. Specifically, the formulations that we use and that are most commonly commercially available have a half-life of up to 30 days. So that means that's in the soil. So that's after if you do broad spectrum spray it could stay around in that soil for 30 days. And that's just to get rid of half of it. So really, if you spray it and it gets in the soil and it's going everywhere, you will want to wait several months before planting anything else, because it could hang around and kill things for a very long time. So you really want to, only use it in, and if you do use it, you want to make sure it doesn't get into the soil and only goes on the plants. That's what I'll say about that. So it is an option and it's good for woody plants, but it's definitely not doesn't break down quite as easily as glyphosate or clethodim, and can cause some accidental damage, especially if you spray it in the soil nearby a plant that you like. If it gets in the soil, there's roots that are in there from plants that are beneficial, you might kill. So you gotta be very careful.
There's been a lot of questions in the chat comments about chemical names, and just to clarify, most of what we're talking about is, and that Jack's been mentioning for the most part, are the active ingredients. So like glyphosate is the active ingredient in Roundup, which is the brand name. We are not recommending Roundup. Glyphosate is also the active ingredient in an aquatic safe formula called Rodeo, which we are suggesting is, if you're going that route, is what you would want to use. Triclopier and clethodim are both active ingredients. In the chat, we've put the names of some brand names that you could look for that are aquatic safe, that we would encourage. I think one other thing just to mention with triclopier is that there's essentially, within triclopier, just to make this more complicated, there's what's called an amine or water-based formula and an ester or oil-based formula. The ester is much stronger, and that's something that you might use if you were cut stumping like a really problematic tree, like an autumn olive or a tree of heaven. You should never, ever spray that. It just kind of explodes and goes everywhere and it will kill everything in sight. So if you're spraying, always make sure you have the water-based formula, which is the Garlon 3A. And I believe, Deb, you've certainly used the Garlon 3A, and it sounds like, Jack, you have too, for cut stumping as well. So there may be just no justification for Garlon 4 or the equivalent, which is the ester. So it
No,
sounds
I use the Triclopyr 3, and I use it for autumn olives exclusively, which is a very woody invasive on my property. Sari can tell you I have almost a monoculture around the outside edges of 7 acres, and it's quite thick and quite old. Some of this trees are 10 to 15 feet tall, and the stumps can be 4, 5, 6 inches around. So yeah, and that's what I use exclusively, just for the autumn olive. I don't use it anywhere else.
yeah. So that makes sense. But I know that we are actually getting close to the end of time, but there's still a lot of questions, and we haven't really covered some alternative methods.
There was a request that you speak a little more slowly, because so people can catch these. I mean, one person said that. I don't know if everyone heard.
Sure. We will try. We have a lot to cover here, don't we? And I guess one thing we should add is that you will be sent the video, so you can rewatch this as many times as you want to. So we have endless entertainment for you there. But I think, Sonia, do you think it makes sense to just keep going a little bit and talk about some of the alternative non-herbicide methods like weed suppression?
Yeah, I would say let's keep going. And if folks need to drop off, we understand, because there's a lot that
Right.
we're cramming in. And again, you will get the video, and you can check this out on Facebook, and you'll get the chat log too. But yeah, let's keep rolling.
Yeah,
This is
and
lots of information to
Just
share.
to sort of add, and we will at the, for those of you who stick around to the end, we will be running a poll, which includes questions about what you would like to see in the future if we end up expanding this into a longer series, which will be funding dependent and interest dependent. But we, yeah. So if you have to jump off before we run the poll and you want to put some of that in chat, feel free. What type of topics you would like to see gone into in more depth. And we also, again, for anybody who has to jump up early, we hope that you will check out our website and our organization and support us as a member so that we can keep doing programs like this. Get involved as a volunteer. We can use both virtual volunteers and volunteers in person. We've got some exciting opportunities now for the science team that's monitoring some of the Making Trash Bloom projects, and an event called the Big Bug Bio Blitz, which is coming up in about a month in partnership with the State Arboretum and the Smithsonian, literally counting bugs and plants. So that should be fun. But just kind of going back to alternative methods, one question that we're asked a lot is, oh, well, what about organic herbicides? Or, what about, like, I heard vinegar works or salt works or boiling water works. Anybody want to take that? I know you all have opinions on this.
Well, first of all, it rarely works. Salt also is very, very damaging to your soil structure and the soil in general, and is one of the things that Extension Agency soil tests test for, is how much salt is in your water or in your ground. So I definitely do not advise the use of salt at all. Vinegar, I haven't found that it works. Mom has tried it. A lot of times I have a problem with my walkway, that it gets little weeds in between the bricks, and she's determined to kill them all, but does not work. And I can also say that I haven't had a whole lot of success with boiling water. Although Sari said that she used it on some small plants and it worked out for her. So
very small, about a centimeter tall. Yeah.
So I'm going to say no. And in addition to the fact that it doesn't work as well and you can really poison your soil, and vinegar does make some funky things with your pH. Anyway, the options that are available to us that are quote unquote organic are not necessarily safe or good for your soil. Dishwashing soap is one thing that's very, very harsh for our aquatics, toads and salamanders and so on. So I don't use dish soap on anything at all ever outside my dishes, or maybe some laundry spills, but that's about it. So I stay away from those homemade cheating type things exclusively. I don't even use them. Jack, do you have anything that you want to add to that?
Yeah, no, I don't have a whole lot of experience using them. I know salt is very, I mean, it's absolutely horrible for your soil health. All the little microbes and everything that live in the soil and make it healthy soil ecosystem get absolutely demolished. So yeah, I don't know much about, I've never tried using vinegar or boiling water though.
But there are some non-herbicide methods and also non-tilling methods
Yes.
that do work. And Deb, you use a lot of them, particularly in your vegetable garden.
Yeah, I do. And one of the things that I absolutely love is newspaper and cardboard. Do a lot of hand weeding and then laying down wet newspaper and putting wood chips over top of it. I use both chipped up drop and local arborists to give me the chips that I need, and I'll even go pick them up in my pickup truck. But the wood chips really do help keep the paper in place, and it keeps the weeds down. It's not perfect because if a weed is aggressive like my maypop, it'll come through my brick sidewalk and it comes through my asphalt driveway. But I just keep pushing it back and cutting it off and do what I can with that. But for the most part, the weed suppression is my major go-to. Right now, we're working on pulling out some non-natives, getting rid of some of the autumn olive, and we're exclusively using thick cardboard layers and wood chips over top of that around the individual plants that we're planting, like the elderberries, the St. John's wort. So I get my natural stuff in there. I'm suppressing the weeds. We are trying golden ragwort to get rid of some remaining stilt grass. That stuff is really hard to get rid of because it just keeps receding. But anyway, the wood chips and the cardboard are my favorites.
And it's something that because they do break down, which is a good thing for the environment, and they'll add nutrients to the soil, but it can be sort of a bad thing for you in the sense that, okay, am I going to have to keep doing this forever? But the idea is that no, you won't, because say you're doing it around a tree or like Deb's elderberry bush. For elderberry bush, hopefully by the time that the cardboard and the wood chips disintegrate, her elderberry bush is going to be tall enough that it can outcompete whatever's growing around it. Or, if she did it around perennials, they'll start filling in and they'll be coming up through the cardboard.
And then but the major part is that the cardboard and the wood chips add to the soil structure. It will compost down. So it's just like using a compost, but it's over time. That's what I need to do, is to build up the soil structure too. And then, like you said, the perennials that are also around there will go to seed and hopefully grow in and literally outcompete simply because the other things have been suppressed.
And a more extreme version of what Deb is doing with the cardboard and the wood chips is black plastic or clear plastic used for what's called solarization. And so that's sometimes used if you need to kill something very quickly, you want to kill everything. Also, perhaps if you have diseases, for example, if you've had tomato blight really badly in a particular bed and you need to plant tomatoes there again, within a couple of years, you can't wait for it to cycle out. you can kill everything by putting a thick layer of, some people put clear plastic, some do black plastic. This is another one though that there are drawbacks to, because it really kills everything. You know, it will kill the invasive seed bank under there, but it will also kill a lot of the good microbes and the things in the soil structure that we're telling you that you want to prize. And so Deb's cardboard method is not as permanent, it's not as dramatic, but it protects the good stuff in the soil.
A few good notes on that. For the solarization, the real ideal behind it is not that you're cutting off the plant's access to light, like, which is what you're doing with the cardboard. The idea is that you're making the ground so hot that the plant
Right.
is not lit.
Yes.
So to that end, it is actually more effective. So ideally, you want to do it in the middle of the summer when it's the hottest time. So for if you genuinely want to do the solarization option, is one thing that I recommend. I get a lot of people coming to me who say like, oh, I love native plants and I have a yard that I don't like and I want to turn some of my grass into a native wildflower meadow. I'm like, hey, we got to kill the grass first. So if you have a small area that you want to do that, this is a great method. It's a great way to just kill the grass. So you can have a blank slate for seeding something. And you want to use black plastic, and you want to really get that all the way. You want to get it as tight to the ground as possible. So anything that's under, you want to mow as low as you can go, and then you want to really get that on the ground. Make sure it's really weighed down all the way around. And you're going to need a lot more weight than you think to keep it down. But the clear plastic is actually more effective than the black plastic. You think the black plastic is going to be better because you think of like black materials getting really hot, but the clear plastic actually lets more light in and gets hotter than the black plastic does. But
Yeah.
if where you're living is not very warm, if you're up in Canada and you're doing it in the fall and it doesn't get very hot, maybe black plastic would be better, because then that just cuts off the plant's access to light, which can kill it, but it takes longer.
So we did the black plastic. We did solarization for our first pilot plot for making trash bloom, because we were doing it as a demonstration for the community, and it wasn't on a trash cell. It was on an area where there had been grass, and we wanted exactly what Jack said, to demonstrate that this is a great way to kill a small amount of grass and weeds fast. But we did have some interesting experiences with it. We didn't really want to go out and buy plastic and contribute to the plastic industry. So we asked the landfill, okay, do you have any 6 mil thick plastic, about the thickness of a contractor bag? And they said, no, but we have 60 mil thick plastic. So what this was actually the trash liners that they used to line the trash cells with and keep all the toxicity from seeping into the groundwater. And we thought, all right, we have never heard of solarizing with something this thick. This is going to be a huge experiment. And we did see some of the things that Jack said. First of all, the landfill put it down on a day when we weren't there. They didn't know you had to weigh it down. I got a call from the site supervisor at 7 a.m. the next day. This isn't going to work. That thing's rolled up like a burrito at the other side of the landfill. And so it had to be dragged back and, weighed down with old tires and railroad ties. It did sit there all summer. It mostly killed things. But the other issue we had, because it was so thick and heavy, was that we couldn't get it flat enough. And what Jack mentioned about it needs to be in contact with the ground to really fry the plants. Otherwise, you create a hot air pocket, and some plants can actually do better in that. So, yeah.
Yeah, but if you do have something that's totally, impervious, like no light can get through at all, like just like completely black, you can still kill plants that are underneath there. You're probably not going to kill the seeds that are in there. So it's like solarization is great because it gets so hot, it kills the plants and it kills the seed bank. But if you're just cutting off access to light, it will kill the plants, but you have to leave it on there for about a full year. It takes a very long time to actually kill the plants just by cutting off the light. So just something to keep in mind, it is possible, but you just have to plan more time to do it that way. And what Deb said about doing the cardboard and putting some mulch over top, that's if you have a small area and you want to like get a little garden going and you just want to keep weeds from coming up around the plants that you put in. I've done that before in my little front yard. I have a little native perennial patch in my front yard, and yeah, it's great. You put your plants in, you put the cardboard right around everything, and then you just cover it all with some leaf mulch or some wood chip mulch or whatever, make it look nice. Nobody knows the cardboard's under there, and after a few years, it'll decompose. So that's a good option. I also highly recommend, if you are using black plastic, please pull it up when you're done. leave it on there for a year or however long it takes, but pull it up and dispose of it properly. It is very, trust me, in the long term, you don't want to just leave it sitting there forever, because even if you cover it with mulch and you have it out of sight, out of mind, it never fully decomposes, but it'll start to degrade. So you have like a million pieces of plastic and they'll just be all over your yard. It's not fun.
And they too will end up in the watershed and
Yeah.
microplastics, and it will not be, it will not be good.
That
So
plastic landscape fabric stuff is the bane of my existence. I do not like it.
yeah. And like we said, there's really trade-offs to pretty much every method of weed control. And I think we led pretty strongly when we were marketing this event with, there's no perfect solution, but there are better solutions, and there are solutions that really minimize your inputs, whether it's your time, your money, your energy, or chemicals or whatever you may be using for that. Is there anything else that we didn't cover, or questions that we want into that are urgent? And we know we probably have not gotten to everybody's questions and specific questions, but we really encourage you to continue to come to our programs and to get involved as members and volunteers, and get on our Facebook groups and stuff.
We
Yes.
had a specific question, I think from more than one person, about Johnson grass.
Well, if anybody finds the magic bullet for Johnson grass, we would love to know about that, because that is a big problem with the Shenandoah County landfill. That site that we're putting in the fall, Jack, is next to a giant hill pretty much covered in Johnson grass.
Yeah, I have some experience with that. We are currently trying out using some of that clethodim, that herbicide I was talking about earlier. That's a relatively grass specific herbicide. So we're trying some of that out on some patches of Johnson grass at the Arboretum. We're still early on in that trial, so I don't know for sure how well it will go. But it is grass specific, so theoretically it should be effective at Johnson grass. I've seen it be effective at other grasses. I think you can at least get some impact. I don't know how. I don't know if it'll get 100% kill, but if I knew for sure, I'd let you know. Other than that, it's hard. I've had some, I've got a little crew of volunteers that helps out with me at the Arboretum, and when we see a patch of Johnson grass, if it's just one little patch by itself, we'll get out there with shovels and just dig it out. And you just got to dig all the way around the plant and get every little root piece out. And you can get rid of it if you dig it out, but it has pretty prodigious roots. If you've got a lot of it, that's a much more difficult challenge.
All the volunteers in the world are not getting rid of the Johnson grass at the Shenandoah County landfill.
A little bit of spot spraying can go a long way. You don't spray the entire village. You just target those patches of Johnson grass. And you can also try, if you're okay with mowing at certain times, like you can just try to plant things that will compete well against it. There are some native warm season grasses that can actually outcompete Johnson grass. You have Indian grass, big blue stem, stuff like that, which I have seen, if you plant them and get them started, they get 8 feet tall, just as big as Johnson grass, and they can actually start to smother it out once they get dense enough. But yeah, it's hard.
Yeah, Jack, that's a good point, that there's something about Johnson grass is that it is a warm season grass. So it's like what I was talking about earlier with stilt grass, that it's most active in the summer. So most of the grasses that people want, which we don't necessarily want because they're mostly not native, but that are used in pastures and lawns, are cool season grasses like tall fescue and everything. So part of why Johnson grass does so well in pastures and areas like that is because it's growing at a time when they're not.
Yes.
But the grasses that Jack mentioned, the different blue stems, the Indian grass, those are both native, so they are far better than tall fescue and the lawn grasses. But they also are warm season grasses, so they're fighting with Johnson grass on its turf at the right time.
They grow at the same time of year as Johnson grass does, and so there's if you're in the Eastern United States, which is where I think a lot of our listeners are from, so this is not going to apply to you if you're, in Australia or wherever. But the big three grasses for warm season native grasses that get really tall like that, like Johnson grass, and could compete with it, are big blue stem, Indian grass, and switchgrass. So if you look up any of those 3 grasses, they are available as seed. You can get them from several different native seed suppliers, and they're good. They're good to plant if you want to if you just want to get rid of the Johnson grass with something native, something a little bit better for the environment. That's an option. Also consider planting other, not just, if you have a lot of Johnson grass, it's probably a good spot for a nice native warm season meadow. You could put some of those native grasses in. You could put in mix in some other tall native species. Some sunflowers, some big asters and stuff like that, and you'll have a whole nice pollinator habitat there.
And it'll be much better to look at, much more
And
interesting.
much nicer to look at.
Yeah.
Yes.
So, and we have
Bermuda grass is my problem.
So somebody had asked about ground fabric, which is landscape fabric, and I think that's an issue where there are different qualities of it, and the cheap stuff, as I've found out the hard way, it's kind of a waste of plasticky whatever. Not the plants still come up under it. It rips. It's not recyclable. Deb, you've been using something this year, right? Am I thinking somebody, I think it was you, said that they were using some really high quality landscape fabric this year that they were pleased with? Was that you?
Yeah, it's not called landscape fabric though. It's actually considered a weed suppressant, and it's agricultural grade, and I buy it from an agricultural provider. So I think it's Premier One. That's also where I got my greenhouse. But yeah, and that stuff lasts. Somebody mentioned that if you use just black plastic, like a black plastic trash bag, it biodegrades very, very quickly and just rips up into pieces. And I can tell you the people that used to live in my farm had that, and I'm constantly finding chunks of black plastic that's just, it's a mess. But anyway, this agricultural grade weed suppressant plastic is it's a much higher quality. It's a little bit thicker. It almost looks like it's a weave, but it's not a fabric per se. And I have high success with that, and it generally lasts 3 or 4 years before I have to roll it up and throw it out because it's gotten holes in it. So
and farmers, I mean, it's ag fabric. So this is what, farmers do use all the time for growing their crops through. And it's kind of been tested over the years.
It's not the plastic. It's not the plastic that's like a stretchy plastic, like you'll see sometimes where they roll it out and then they pop holes in it. This is actually more of a woven product. If anybody has any questions, they can send us a chat on our Facebook page, and I'll look it up and get the information for you.
It's also worth thinking about what you're using it for. I don't know like what the specific use case is, but I've seen it used for trails and paths and stuff to put underneath as a weed suppressant. And I actually don't recommend it for that, just because if you want the trail to last for longer than 10 years, I mean, it'll do great for that long, but eventually, it does start to just break down, and it doesn't hold up forever. And then if you put gravel or whatever on top of it, once that gravel gets washed away, then you have all this landscape fabric poking up everywhere. I would much rather if you're doing like path or trail, get some really hard packed, like road-based gravel. Just kind of put that down as the base for weed suppressant, and then put whatever your walking surface is on top of that. But that's just a little niche case. I've got a problem with that.
Well, I think we have, covered quite a lot, and I see that most of our audience has actually stuck with us, and we're grateful. We know that weeds are a fascinating topic, frustrating, but it's good to have support. It's good to have a peer support group of equally frustrated people exchanging ideas and finding solutions, and so we, as I'd encourage you to stay involved. In the poll that Sonia's put up, there's some questions about what you would like to see in future programs. We do programs for the agricultural community, for professional farmers and growers, as well as for home gardeners and hobbyists, really for the whole continuum. And So if you're looking for something that is particularly specialized for your sector, let us know. And we will try to find funding to pull it together for you. So, all right. Anything else to add, guys? I think we're good. Well, thank you all so much. And again, huge appreciations to our panelists and our partners and everyone who's really been involved in putting this together and cheered us on from the sidelines and said, oh yeah, people really need this. It's a topic that needs a bit more. And we look forward to continuing the journey with you.
It was a fun conversation. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Good night, guys.
Cheers.
See you soon.